I had been house hunting for months, carefully checking neighborhoods, prices, and the fine print that comes with each property. One thing I knew for sure wanted nothing to do with a homeowners association. I'd heard too many horror stories about people being fined for leaving a trash can out too long, painting their door the wrong shade, or even having the wrong type of flowers in their garden. So when I found a beautiful house right next to an HOA community, but just outside their jurisdiction, it felt like the perfect match. The house had character, space, and most importantly, freedom. I went through all the paperwork with extra caution, making absolutely sure there was no hidden clause binding me to the HOA. The realtor even emphasized that this property was its own lot, separate from the development across the fence. That detail made me feel like I had struck gold. After closing the deal, I was beyond excited to move in. I could already imagine customizing my home however I wanted, planting my own garden, and not worrying about some committee telling me what I could or couldn't do with my own space. Very first morning after I moved in, I was unloading boxes from the truck when I noticed a woman marching across the lawn with a clipboard clutched in her hand. She looked like she was on a mission, and before I could even greet her, she was already raising her voice. She demanded to know what I was doing there, acting as if I was trespassing on her personal property. Her tone was sharp and her body language screamed hostility. She introduced herself as the head of the HOA and insisted that I needed to report to her before moving in. When I explained that my house was not part of the HOA, she cut me off mid-sentence, pointing to the neighborhood sign and claiming that all properties in the area were under their control. She accused me of trying to sneak into the community without proper approval, and went as far as to shout that I could not live there. Neighbors began to peek out from their porches, watching the scene unfold, while Karen continued escalating, her voice getting louder with each word. She kept insisting I would be forced to follow their rules whether I liked it or not. She didn't just stop shouting across the lawn, she marched right up to my driveway, eyes wide and furious, waving her clipboard like it was some kind of badge of authority. She kept repeating that this was her community and that every single property in sight fell under her jurisdiction. The more I tried to calmly explain that my deed specifically showed I wasn't part of the HOA, the more she interrupted me, talking over everything I said. She accused me of cheating the system and trying to get away with things other homeowners couldn't. Her tone carried this sense of entitlement, like she genuinely believed she owned the entire block. At one point, she even tried to demand a copy of my closing documents, insisting she had the right to review them because, in her words, we don't just let anyone move in. By now, the situation was drawing attention, and I could see a few curious faces lingering behind windows, clearly entertained by the drama. Karen's voice echoed through the cul-de-sac as she threatened to call the board and take action. Immediately, she looked absolutely convinced that she had the power to dictate whether or not I could unpack my own boxes. I stood there listening to her rant, and instead of getting flustered, I reminded myself that I had every legal right to be in my home. I calmly explained that I had reviewed the title, the property lines, and every document tied to my purchase. My house was its own parcel, completely outside the jurisdiction of her HOA. I even mentioned that my realtor and lawyer had double-checked everything before closing, so there was no possible mistake. She didn't like hearing that. She tried waving her clipboard again, saying their rules applied to the whole street, but I held firm and repeated that their authority stopped at the edge of their subdivision. I made it clear that unless she could produce a legal document with my address on it, she had no grounds to demand anything from me. Each time she barked an order, I responded with facts, refusing to let her intimidation tactics work. What struck me most was how unprepared she was for someone to actually push back. She was so used to people caving to her demands that she looked stunned when I didn't back down, and the angrier she became. The calmer I spoke when she realized her shouting and clipboard waving weren't getting her the results she wanted. She switched tactics and started making threats. She said she would fine me every single day I stayed in the house, racking up hundreds of dollars until I complied. I told her again that she had no legal authority over my property, but that didn't stop her. She warned that she would get the HOA's lawyer involved and drag me into court if I didn't. Register with the association immediately. Then she moved on to scare tactics about utilities, claiming they could cut off my water and trash service if I refused to cooperate. It was obvious she was making things up on the spot. But she said it with such confidence that someone unfamiliar with HOA rules might have believed her. At one point, she even threatened to report me to the city for zoning violations. Though she couldn't name a single law I was supposedly breaking. Her voice grew sharper and more frantic as she tried to regain control of the situation. Every sentence was another warning, another promise of consequences. Another desperate attempt to intimidate me into surrendering to rules that didn't apply after days of back-and-forth drama. The situation finally reached a point where it couldn't be ignored anymore. Karen had rallied a few of her HOA board members, and they showed up at my property with printed papers, claiming they proved I was under their control. I calmly invited them to lay out their evidence, and as soon as I looked over the documents, it was clear my address wasn't listed anywhere. My deed was separate, my property lines were separate, and my house stood completely outside their HOA jurisdiction. To be sure, I even contacted my lawyer and had him confirm everything in writing. Once that letter was presented, the board members began to back off, realizing they had no actual case. Karen, however, was not ready to let go. She argued, yelled, and tried twisting the wording of her documents, but her own peers weren't supporting her anymore. The neighbors who had witnessed her behavior started whispering among themselves, clearly seeing her obsession for what it was. Eventually, she was left standing there, red-faced and flustered, with no power to enforce anything against me. The HOA had no claim, no authority, and no legal standing over my home.